Yeah, welcome to my talk, Developer Diary Journey of a Payment Integration. What we will do today is I will talk a bit about the payment integration we did in URide. I will tell a bit more about URide in a few seconds and the lessons we learned along the way, because it was not always that easy. Okay, so who am I? I am Nino. I am founder of the GDG Nuremberg. So 2016, I actually moved from Berlin to Nuremberg and I founded this GDG there. We have a coding space, so we regularly talk about Flutter topics, help each other. We have a great Flutter community over there. And since a few months, I'm also the founder and organizer of the CTO Lunch Nuremberg. We regularly meet and talk about CTO topics. So basically, what do you do when you have like this overview of the whole tech? What problems there are usually when you have to maintain such a huge, such a platform and all these kind of topics. And it's also a culinary exploration of Nuremberg always. So it's kind of a great event as well. I'm the CTO and co-founder of URide, which is a mobility startup. What is URide? It's a mobility as a service solution for B2B. So we target customers. We have also big partners like Siemens Healthineers, Adidas, etc. And what we basically offer is to make their mobility more sustainable in a holistic approach. As you can see, we offer different products. Some of them need payment. For example, the job ticket, which is like a bigger amount of money you have to pay. You can also do ride sharing on this platform and book like more like micro payments here. We integrate shuttle buses for those big customers, and we have a mobility budget and a parking and charging solution. So whenever you're interested in employee mobility, come to talk to me. All right, let's get to the talk. All entities and events in this talk, even those based on real entities and events, are entirely fictional. In addition, the following talk contains explicit language and should be avoided by anyone. So if you don't like explicit language, you should leave right now. So actually, we will talk, or we will listen to a fictional developer which talks about the payment integration into an app called URide, which is completely fictional. And so here's the first entry. Dear Diary, finally finished the web refactoring of and Stripe payment. And gotta say, it's crazy how many technologies can be involved in one refactoring, and how good intentions and something that is simple to integrate can develop into a real pita. So what's a pita actually? Anyone knows what a pita is? Audience answers only. Pain in the ass. Perfect. So it's a pain in the ass. And it's fun to say that out loud. All right. Apart from that, we will touch a few topics. We will, of course, talk about Flutter, Dart, because that's the technology we are using. We talk about our first approach, our plugin approach, how we solve the payment integration with channel communication. We had to write our first a little plugin for that, and how we then pivoted to a web-based approach. And this is actually where the problems really started. So, and when talking about web implementation of a payment solution, you will have to be aware of some things according to WebView. You have to know what web in-app browsers do. I will quickly go into what different kinds of deep links there are, and how we then became creative by using other tech, for example, Firebase Cloud Functions or Firebase Hosting. So let's go a bit back in time. You saw the developer was like really happy that he finally made this refactoring. So let's go into a place where he was not that happy yet, or maybe still happy. Developer diary, first integration. Dear diary, today I finished the integration of the native SDKs in Android and iOS. It's really a pain that those libs are not distributed via Maven or Pod, but need to be downloaded and included manually. Still got my hands dirty on channel communication now and thinking of making it a plugin. Does everyone know here what Maven and Pod is? Just to be, okay. And any experience with Android and iOS? Who's experienced with Android and iOS previously? Nice. Okay. This talk will, whenever this developer touches a certain tag, we will quickly spotlight the stuff he's mentioning and give a short but official overview about the tag he just mentioned. So channels, maybe everyone knows channels, has already worked with channels, but just with, I will just for simplicity's sake tell you what a channel does. Basically, it's the possibility to talk with your native parts of the app, with the Android part, with the iOS part, or any other platform you are using. So basically, you open up a method channel, then you can send a method call to your platforms. This platform receives this message and does the necessary logic. And once it's done, it actually resends it to your Flutter client. Here's a simple example. I know that you can use the app flavor environment variable to achieve the same, but for demonstration purposes, I chose this flavor approach. So we actually want to get with this channel the current flavor of our app. So we create a method channel which is called flavor. We invoke on this channel a method which is called getFlavor, and we await this response and then can return the flavor to our app. Here is the Android implementation. I create an object that is called flavor channel, and on this flavor channel I call a configure method. That's something I did by myself, so that's nothing which comes from the framework. You see in the Flutter activity or the main activity of your app part, you can override this configure Flutter engine. And also here, you can configure this channel and get to the binary messenger, which is kind of the heart of this channel communication. So if we jump into this method, this configure method, you see that I create a method channel, use the same name as the same I used before in the Flutter code, and set a method called handler on it. And I was very explicit with the arguments you get in the callback. So you see, you get a method call, a method channel result, and then you can check on the call, is the current trigger of this method actually the method I'm expecting? If yes, then you can do the necessary logic. In this case, it's very simple to get the flavor from the build config in Android. And then we return that. On the iOS side, it's pretty much the same. We simply get it here from the dictionary. Okay. So just to say what we actually did right now. So we encapsulated the logic. We can encapsulate this logic, this channel communication logic, also into a package. This is basically what we did then. And any package that contains native parts like Android, iOS can be called a plugin. So that's kind of also the terms we are using. Here you can find a more detailed example in the docs, Flutter docs. They also cover all the other platforms. All right, developer diary. First P task. Dear diary. Oh, what was it, Peter, again? Well, I'm just joking. Today, Visa updated their logo. Logos are hard-coded in the SDKs. We therefore had to replace the SDKs in Android and iOS, which was a real pain in the butt. Not only that the Visa updated their logo, there were other breaking changes along the way. I don't want to get into detail about all of those, but it just should show that these were all events, or these events were kind of the trigger for us to maintain this plugin we wrote and to touch our existing code. So, PITAs with the plugin approach. Native docs in general are meant for native integration. So the and Stripe payment provider we are using had documentation, but for the native parts, for Android and iOS. And we first always had to find out how can we integrate this actually into our plugin. So you saw that, for example, the Flutter activity, the main activity of your Android part uses the Flutter activity, extends the Flutter activity. In the official documentation, it was mentioned you can start activity for result to retrieve to start a new activity of the plugin, of the library, and then you would have to retrieve the result with overwriting on activity result in Android. So this was an example where it was kind of complicated to do this transfer between how do you actually natively implement it and how is it done in Flutter. And also that during this implementation, the kind of way how Android does it by itself also changed. So this is the other thing. The Stripe payment libraries were not always up to date with the native platform developments. And in general, the manual library integration was also a pain. It's basically what I just said. Developer diary, a bright new future. Dear diary, we finally decided to get rid of those libs and use a simple web-based payment interface. Stripe Payment also provides a SAQA compliant HTML payment form solution, which we are going to use. So just to make clear what SAQA compliant means, it basically means we don't have to handle any credit card numbers, any PINs, or any other stuff. So this SDK handles all this for us. We just send the information to the bank, and then the bank does the rest. And let's have a quick look at how the payment process in general looks like and what we are actually replacing here. So the payment process is built like this. We get a checkout ID. We then show a payment UI. And in the same step, actually, we also pre-authorize the payment when the payment, like when you push the button and you get redirected and stuff. And then we can react to a payment deep link. And we know, okay, the payment has been done. And then we can get the payment status to decide was it successfully or not. And if we want to capture right away, we can do this, but we can also capture it up to 2 weeks into the future. So that's basically how the payment process looks like. What we are actually replacing is only show payment UI and pre-authorize payment. These 2 steps, which are basically 1 step. By the way, also React to payment deep link was also not always in the native implementation. Was it also kind of this makes it easier in the web because you could have a synchronous response to the payment. But you could also have an asynchronous response to the payment. For example, if you needed to do 3D secure for bigger amounts. And then you would also have to implement the deep link logic for handling those cases. And now using the web-based approach, that's actually really a benefit. We streamline this process to always be the payment, the deep link process. So the hope was, like, this integration doesn't give us any breaking changes anymore. And it's a future-proof solution. So once developed, never touched again. The promise was also it was easy as a pie to integrate. But the reality was actually PITA. So if you expect something sweet and you get a PITA, maybe not the best. Here are a few things which we will cover in detail, like in the following slides. So why was it actually a PITA? So we touched now already Flutter Dart. We talked about Flutter Dart, the channel plugin communication. And now we go into the web technologies. The first idea was, let's integrate the payment in a web view. Super easy, kind of nice, integrates into the widget tree, and we have this whole logic which I showed you before in a block set up. This is well tested, so whenever I get on show payment UI, I can simply show the web view. And whenever there's an error, I can show an error widget, whatever. Unfortunately, no web view. Developer diary. Dear diary, today I realized that my concept of integrating the payment UI with a web view is not possible. The banks don't trust me that I don't inject JavaScript, modify the DOM, intercept network requests, make sure that I never load content in an insecure context. In other words, they force me to use an in-app browser. So that's the story. What have we learned now for a web view? And except that Peter means pain in the ass. Messing around with JavaScript, calling sensitive things in a web view is not a good thing. So this applies to login, this applies to banking stuff. So whenever you handle sensitive user data, you should never use a web view. Okay, so here's an example of an in-app browser. What you will probably see right now, before we had a payment form, HTML form, which we simply could pass the web view. Now we have the problem that an in-app browser only accepts URLs. It's also what its developer is saying. Dear diary, now that I need to use an in-app browser, I need to distribute the HTML form from an endpoint. In-app browsers cannot display simple HTML, but only URLs. Well, that at least is easy as a pie. I'll simply write yet another cloud function. So let's spotlight quickly what Firebase Cloud Functions are. The Firebase team itself says, Cloud Functions for Firebase is a serverless framework that lets you automatically run backend code in response to events triggered by background events, HTTPS requests, the admin SDK, or cloud scheduler jobs. In other words, you can write schedulers that trigger your cloud function. For example, with a well-defined cron syntax, you can react or run those cloud functions with Firestore triggers. They react on whenever a document is created, updated, or deleted. And then you can actually call specific logic. You can write simple HTTPS requests, so like get post endpoints, how we know them, and a more advanced API for that is the on-call API, which you can use, which simplifies authentication and security stuff for you. But the drawback of the on-call implementation is that on both sides you need to use Firebase. Okay, this is an example, a very simplified example of a cloud function. You can see we get a request, we get a response handle, which we then can send the response to. And so we kind of get the requests, take the query parameters, the necessary query parameters for building the checkout HTML string. And once it's successfully done, we can return this HTML form now like prepared for the display together with the 200 back to our app. Here's an example which also covers authentication stuff, but I don't want to go too much into detail here, but please make sure that you also handle authentication when you offer those open APIs. And at the bottom, you can now see that this would be an URL which we could display in the in-app browser. So basically, it consists of the region you are using, your project name, and then some gibberish. And in the end, your Firebase name, the cloud function name. Okay, lessons we have learned so far. Cloud Functions for Firebase lets you easily set up an HTTP endpoint for your app. It's actually also easy as a pie to even build a small web application which serves your app with some content. It's really straightforward. And if you want to know more about Cloud Functions, you can scan this QR code. Next chapter of our developer diary. Which in-app browser plugin? Dear diary, I'm currently looking into different in-app browsers plugins. The user might simply close the browser without paying. So either I handle this case with a widget lifecycle, or the plugin comes with an on-close callback. Also, I definitely want to use the well-maintained package. Okay, so manually close the open browser is always possible. So here's like, I show 3 different plugins for an inner browser. First, you can use the standard URL launcher, and I would recommend this to use for any case which is not very special. Then you have the Flutter in-app web view package, which is also very known and maintained package. And the Flutter custom tabs, which more or less like builds on the in-app browser APIs from Android, I would say, which is more close to those. And which was also important is like we also wanted to consider the package size. So URL launcher is very small, does not a lot, but that very good. Then you have the Flutter in-app web view package, which is, for example, pretty big because it has a lot of functionality. And the Flutter custom tab package is also kind of small. And we finally decided, actually, even though it's very big, for Flutter in-app web view, because it had like this on-close callback on the browser. So you could realize the user just closed the browser, we have to do some stuff. We also did implement it with a widget lifecycle, but this is way more convenient to use. And so we also had this already in place, so we used this. This is basically what I just said. So use the URL launcher whenever it's not necessary to use something else. And also don't write code in a way that you need to close a screen when the browser closes, because that's actually an architectural problem we introduced by replacing the web view with the in-app browser, which we solved, by the way, right now. But so whenever you change technology, also rethink the approaches you are using. Different in-app browser plugins also behave kind of differently in certain cases. Make sure that you especially always test with other default browsers than Chrome, because that's also a PETA. Dear Diary. This is a good one. I realized that when I passed the payment provider a custom URL scheme as redirect URL, the native Google payment sheet doesn't show up, but the browser. This seems to be an undocumented requirement of Iron Stripe payment. So I need to use universal links in iOS and set up app links for Android. I have to tell you, the whole integration becomes a real PETA. Okay, so now let's quickly spotlight what different deep links there are, what's beneficial on both sides. So basically you have the custom URL scheme, which is like the old deep linking I used in the past very, very often. It has a custom scheme. So if you look at the URL schema, you will see it's the EU-read app. So it's basically an app identifier, which you can use as scheme. And the HTTP one is using a dedicated URL and a domain, which you are also owning. And why shouldn't I use custom scheme anymore, or if it's about sensitive data? Because any other app can actually say, I also want to get this domain, I also want to intercept this deep linking, and then could basically get information from your deep link, which you don't want other apps to have. A custom URL scheme, deep link, as it is called in Android, can be intercepted by other apps and is therefore considered insecure. Using universal links or app links, in contrary, is considered secure, as you have to prove that you own the domain you are calling with. And this is done by certain files, which you have to provide somewhere. All right, then let's also go to the next chapter, actually, because we have to provide those files somewhere. For the setup of app links and universal links, I need to provide documents at the well-known path of my domain. Loving how easy it is to set up a Firebase hosting project for my domain and also host those files there. Besides, I can also provide the Apple Pay certificate in the same way, which I need for the payment. Let's quickly spotlight what Firebase hosting is. Probably you've heard it already a lot. I've also heard talks here already, which were handling hosting very quickly and briefly, but just for the complicity's sake, let's also talk about that. So with Firebase hosting and your DNS provider, you can define like any custom domain you want to have. For example, in our case, it's payment.uri.de, or let's consider this as a valid payment domain, as a subdomain. And then you can also host files in this hosting project, for example, in the well-known folder. And you need those for setting up app links, universal links, and also Apple Pay. And the best thing about it is actually you can use your hosting project also to write a well-defined API for your cloud functions. And that's what I want to spotlight a bit in the next slide. So you can use a rewrite rule. And this is actually different than a redirect. A redirect would return some HTTP code and tell your browser, okay, this is actually, I actually have moved to another URL, and please reload this again inside the browser. A rewrite rule does this actually under the hood. And so you can easily move your clean URLs, for example, payment URI.de checkout, to your cloud functions inside your Firebase JSON file. And so this actually makes it super easy to set up those nicely URLs, and also to set up payment, which is done on the domain you are actually owning. So here's an example for the rewrite rule, how it looks like. Hopefully it's not too small, but it's as easy as that, as saying, okay, the source path is checkout, and I want to redirect this to my cloud function checkout HTML. Okay, this is about the asset links. We could skip that right now. Lessons learned. It's super easy to quickly set up a hosting project, use hosting for providing necessary files for your subdomains, for example, for deep linking, for payment, and use hosting's rewrite rules to build a well-defined API. So now we kind of touched all the technology I was telling you before. And as I see, I also have time for some questions. So the developer still wants to say something. So let's give him the word. Dear Diary, finally finished the web integration. It's been way more work than expected, but hopefully now without breaking changes. But honestly, I would have preferred to stay with the plugin approach in the end, considering refactoring to plugin approach soon. So before that happens, I will probably let him go, but lessons learned. When choosing a third-party provider, and that's actually the most important learning of the whole thing here, that's why I was telling you that, always consider not only the pricing someone gives you, but also the development and implementation costs that come with it. So probably 80% of you which implemented payments used Stripe. And why did you use it? Because it's the most convenient and accomplished payment solution in Flutter and in other platforms as well. And this is really a good way to go, because they already have set up everything for you to make it super convenient for you. And we in the beginning, we went another way, or we still go another way. And we save a lot of money with that, but it came with a lot of development and implementation costs. So that's something you definitely have to consider when going for such approaches. And in general, be never afraid of writing plugins, because it's actually a straightforward and easy way to communicate with Android, iOS, and any other platform you're using. And when going for web-based things, consider that it can become a PETA, because web view is not secure, in-app browsers behave differently in certain cases, and also be, in general, always creative with your tech. Whenever you kind of feel stuck, there comes some technology for your rescue, which you can use to circumvent this current problem. So find me on LinkedIn, find me on X, Mastodon, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them here. I don't know how many. I think we have five more minutes left, so feel free to ask them now. And also, if you can always reach me there. Thank you so much.